There is a version of history where the ocean was not a wall, where the Pacific, vast and unhurried, became not an obstacle but an open question. A long, quiet question asked by the horizon itself. Where men stood at the edge of the shore at Tumbes, at the place where the land simply stopped, and looked west at the gray water, and felt something that was not fear, something closer to recognition. As if the distance had always been there, waiting to be crossed, and the only thing that had changed was the willingness to begin. They began with wood. Balsa trunks, enormous and almost weightless, were gathered from the forests to the north and brought to the shore on the backs of workers who sang while they carried. The logs were laid in the sun to dry. The grain of the wood was studied. The natural curve of each trunk was used rather than corrected. Nothing was wasted. The ships that took shape on the northern shore of Tumbes were not forced into form. They were coaxed into it, the way all good things are made. Cotton sails were woven on frames set up along the beach. Women worked the thread in long, even rows, their hands moving in rhythms that had been handed down across generations. The sails grew wide enough to catch an ocean wind, wide enough to hold the breath of a continent. Bronze guaras were shaped and tested in shallow water. These were the steering fins, lowered through slotted hulls to control direction without moving the sail. A technology of rare elegance, a system that trusted the water rather than fought it. The navigators prepared in their own way. They walked the coast at night, reading the stars with the same patience they gave to everything else. They pressed bare hands into the water and felt the temperature change as currents shifted beneath the surface. They tasted salt concentrations on their fingers. They listened to the sound the waves made against different kinds of shore and learned to tell one from another in the dark. They recorded all of it, not in ink, but in knots, colored cords, twisted and tied in patterns that carried data in their architecture. Memory made tactile, the quipu as logbook, information held in the hands rather than the eyes. When the fleet departed, the sky was the color of pale stone. Priests poured chicha slowly into the dark water near the bows of the largest vessels, a gesture of respect towards something vast and largely unknown. Not from fear, never from fear. The ocean was not an adversary in this worldview. It was a presence to be acknowledged, the way one acknowledges a mountain before crossing it. The pouring was quiet. The fleet was quiet. Even the water seemed to hold still for a moment before the sails filled and the crossing began. The first weeks moved slowly, the way all long journeys do when they are going well. Sailors settled into the routines of open water. Ropes were checked and rechecked. Sails were adjusted by small degrees as the wind shifted through the night. Stores of chuño were rationed from the holds, the freeze-dried potato that kept its nutrition through cold and salt air without spoiling. Dried corn was ground on flat stones and mixed with water from sealed clay jars. The meals were simple. They were enough. On calm evenings, the ocean surface went flat, and the fleet spread across it like a slow thought. Men fished over the sides with lines weighted by bronze hooks. The fish came up silver and were cleaned at the rail and cooked over small clay braziers sheltered from the wind by woven panels. The smell of wood smoke and grilling fish drifted across the water between vessels. Someone played a bone flute. The notes carried a long distance over open water. A few men on a neighboring raft looked up and listened without moving. There were difficult days when the sea rose into walls of gray water and the fleet scattered before reassembling, vessel by vessel, when the storm passed. Days when rain fell for so long that the distinction between sky and sea dissolved, and the navigators worked entirely by feel. Days when the ropes groaned under tension and the guaras kicked against the current, and the men at the steering oars held their positions with both hands and all of their attention and none of their fear. Fear was not useful at sea. It was set aside like unnecessary weight. The helmsmen who worked the night watches developed a particular quality of stillness. They stood at their oars for hours in the dark, feeling the pressure of the water change through the wood, reading the angle of the stars with peripheral vision, making tiny adjustments that kept the fleet on course without anyone needing to be told. They did not speak much during these watches. There was no need. The work was its own language. The ocean asked a question continuously, and the helmsman answered it, quietly, again and again, through the length of the night. Weeks passed. The color of the water changed, slowly, from deep blue-black to something greener and more opaque. Birds appeared in greater numbers, circling the masts, landing briefly on the crossbeams and then lifting away again. The air changed too, becoming cooler, carrying something that the older navigators recognized as the smell of land. That particular mix of soil and vegetation and fresh water that carries across open ocean for days before the coast itself is visible. The navigators did not announce this. They noted it and adjusted the heading by a degree and said nothing more. And then, through the morning mist, through the low gray light of an Atlantic dawn, something resolved on the horizon that was not water. The lookout high on the mast pressed a copper disc to his eye and held still. Rocky cliffs, dark stone, the silhouette of a coast that no one on the fleet had ever seen, rising slowly out of the fog the way all important things reveal themselves. Not all at once, but gradually, giving the mind time to understand what the eyes are already seeing. He stayed there for a long time before he spoke. The fleet turned toward it. Small reed boats were lowered from the sides of the larger rafts. A group of scouts paddled toward shore through the cold chop, their strokes even and unhurried. On the beach, figures were visible. Medieval fishermen checking their lines in the early morning, who had not expected anything to come from the direction of the open sea. Both groups slowed as the distance between them closed. The reed boats ground softly onto the pebbled shore. The scouts stepped out into the shallow water. The fishermen stood with their nets held loosely at their sides. 30 meters of cold morning air separated them. No one moved quickly. No one moved toward a weapon. They simply looked at each other, steadily and without hurry, across the small and enormous distance. The first thing that changed was the ground. An Inca agricultural specialist knelt in a muddy field on the edge of a European village and pressed a seed into the cold soil with his thumb. Slowly, with the care of someone who understood that the earth was not a surface to be worked, but a system to be understood. The peasants standing around him in their rough wool watched without speaking. They had never seen a potato plant, had never imagined a crop that could grow in frost, that could outlast a failed grain harvest, that could be stored for years without rotting. They leaned forward slightly without noticing they were doing it. The agricultural specialist did not speak their language. He did not need to. He showed them how deep to plant. He showed them the spacing between seeds, marking the intervals with a stick pressed lightly into the soil. He showed them how the mounding of earth around the young stem would protect the growing root from cold. He moved patiently through these demonstrations, repeating each one twice, waiting each time for the watching faces to shift from confusion to recognition. When he saw recognition, he moved on. When he did not, he began again. The lesson continued until the light changed and the field had been planted. The potato would eventually restructure European agriculture in ways that none of the people in that muddy field could have predicted. It would reduce famine across large regions. It would extend the growing season into ground that grain could not occupy. It would feed populations through winters that had previously meant hunger. But none of that was visible yet. In that field, in that moment, it was simply a man showing other men how to grow something they had not known existed. Which is, when reduced to its simplest form, what most of the important things in history are. In the harbors, the balsa rafts drew steady crowds from morning to evening. Merchants examined the cotton rigging, running it through their fingers to assess the tension and the weave. Sailors crouched at the waterline and looked at the guaras, the bronze steering fins visible through the clear, shallow water, trying to understand the mechanism by observation alone. Inca crew members allowed this examination without interrupting it. They sat nearby and watched the watchers, occasionally demonstrating how a guara was raised and lowered, allowing the curious to try the motion themselves. Children were, as they always are, the fastest learners. They climbed onto the rafts within the first day and were shown by smiling crew members how to coil a rope correctly, how to tie the simplest knots, how to identify the function of different parts of the sail. They carried this knowledge back to the docks and demonstrated it for other children, who then came to the rafts to learn more. By the end of the first week, there was a small and entirely self-organized school operating on the deck of the largest vessel, conducted in 2 languages that neither group fully understood and somehow managed with gesture and repetition and the particular patience of people who want very much to understand each other. In the quieter spaces, in monastery libraries and stone-walled study rooms, a different kind of exchange was taking place. Quipu keepers sat across from European scholars and unrolled their colored cords across smooth tables. The scholars leaned forward with quills and fresh parchment. The Quipu carried numerical data, administrative records, population counts, in a medium that was simultaneously textile and text. The monks could not decode the system that afternoon, but they began trying, carefully, the way careful people begin things, by recording exactly what they saw without yet claiming to understand it. Inca healers moved through the villages with plant medicines that had been refined across generations at altitude, in climates where the margin for error was narrow and the knowledge consequently precise. They treated infections with preparations that reduced inflammation efficiently. They cleaned wounds with solutions derived from plants that grew above the tree line and had been understood for centuries. They performed procedures with an economy of motion that the physicians watching them recognized, despite the unfamiliar instruments, as competence. The watching physicians took notes. The notes were kept. They passed eventually into wider use. On the hills above the villages, on clear evenings, Inca astronomers traced the paths of stars and planets across the sky for European monks who had their own systems of sky knowledge and their own reasons for tracking the movements of heavenly bodies. There was no argument about whose model was correct. There was no need for an argument. Two different architectures of observation were placed beside each other in the dark, each illuminating what the other had approached from a different angle. And both groups looked up at the same stars and were, each in their own way, satisfied with what the evening had produced. The rope bridge appeared one morning over a river outside a trading town, as if it had grown there overnight. It was made from braided mountain grass, each strand twisted and woven to a tension that distributed weight across the whole structure, rather than concentrating it at any single point. It was, by every measure that mattered, stronger than anything the local engineers had built from timber and iron over the same span. People approached it cautiously. They pressed it with their hands before trusting their feet. The first person to cross walked quickly and arrived on the other side with an expression that was not quite relief and not quite wonder, but something between the two. The caravans that moved between the harbor towns and the inland villages carried things in both directions. Inca traders brought dried chuño and quinoa and small sealed clay jars of medicinal preparations. European traders brought wool and salted fish and fired clay vessels of unfamiliar shape that the Inca traders examined with the same careful curiosity. The exchanges were slow and patient, conducted through gesture and repetition and the small shared vocabulary that had been accumulating since the fleet arrived. No one was in a hurry. The pace of the exchange matched the pace of genuine understanding, which is to say it moved at the speed of trust. Inca weavers set up looms in a large stone building near the harbor, and within the week had attracted a steady group of European observers. The geometric patterns that emerged from the weaving carried meaning in their structure, in the specific arrangement of color and form that a trained reader could interpret as readily as text. The European observers could not yet read these patterns, but they could see the precision required to produce them. and several of them brought their own textile work the following day and sat beside the Inca weavers and showed, in their turn, what their hands knew. The looms in the building produced, by the end of the month, cloth that carried both traditions in its surface, not as a compromise between them, but as something new that neither had made before. By the time formal meetings were arranged between Inca diplomats and the courts of European leaders, the relationship between the two worlds had already been built from below, by farmers and fishermen, and healers, and weavers, and children, by people who had no authority to negotiate and no need to. The diplomats who met in stone halls and exchanged measured greetings were confirming something that had already happened in muddy fields and harbor docks and monastery libraries. The formal ceremony was real, but the real ceremony had been conducted earlier, quietly, without anyone recording it. Cities change in ways that are difficult to notice from inside them. A new doorway appears in a familiar wall. A fountain occupies a square that previously held nothing of consequence. A channel carries water along a hillside that had always relied on rain. None of these changes are large enough, individually, to feel like change. They feel more like correction, like something that had always been missing being quietly supplied. The Inca stonemasons arrived in Madrid in a group of 40, accompanied by a smaller group of administrators and one master mason who had supervised the construction of structures at altitude that had stood for 2 centuries without mortar or maintenance. He walked the streets of Madrid for 3 days before accepting any commission. He studied the existing walls. He placed his hands flat against stone surfaces and felt their load distribution. He looked at the angles of existing doorways and the depth of existing foundations. He asked no questions. He simply looked with the patience of someone who understood that looking carefully was the first and most important part of any construction. The scaffolding went up quietly, in stages, over the course of several weeks. Granite blocks were cut to dimensions specified by the master mason and delivered to the site on wide wooden sledges. The cutting was done with bronze tools and enormous patience. The faces of the blocks were worked until they were flat to tolerances that European masons examined with admiration and mild disbelief. No mortar was laid between the courses. The stones fit against each other the way ideas fit when they are both true. The wall they formed was not a wall that needed to be maintained. It was a wall that intended to remain. European workers joined the construction sites over time, drawn initially by curiosity and then by the recognition that there was something worth learning in what they were watching. The Inca stonemasons did not organize formal instruction. They simply worked and allowed the watching to continue, and answered questions when questions were asked, through the intermediaries who had by now developed enough shared language to carry technical information across. The European apprentices made mistakes. The Inca workers corrected them without impatience, demonstrating the correct technique as many times as was needed, which was usually more than once and rarely more than 3 times. In Paris, the banks of the Seine were restructured over the course of 2 years. Massive dressed stone platforms extended from the bank into the shallow water, creating mooring areas of unusual stability. Wide-stepped approaches led from the street level down to the water's edge. Stone channels were cut along the base of the embankment to manage the seasonal flooding that had troubled the city for as long as anyone could remember. The channels worked. The flooding, when it came, was redirected rather than resisted. The city did not stop the river. It accommodated it, the way sensible cities accommodate the natural forces in which they are embedded. The aqueduct appeared over the rooftops of Paris, the way important things appear when they are built slowly and deliberately. One morning it was simply there, visible from streets where it had not been visible the previous week. A stone channel running at precise gradient across the western edge of the city, carrying fresh water from outside the walls along a route that followed the natural contour of the land. Citizens stopped in the street and looked up at it. Some of them had seen the construction proceeding at the edge of the city over the previous months. Some of them had paid no attention to it. All of them now looked up with the same expression, somewhere between recognition and surprise. The expression of someone seeing something that had been explained to them finally become real. The grain warehouses were built on high ground above both cities, where the air moved freely and the temperature remained more stable than at street level. They were circular stone towers with thick walls and ventilation channels cut at precise intervals to prevent the accumulation of moisture. The construction was methodical and unhurried. Each course of stone was checked before the next was laid. The roof channels were carved to specific gradients. The floors were cut slightly convex at the center so that any water that entered would run outward toward the drainage slots at the wall base rather than pooling. Nothing was approximate. Everything was the result of a calculation that had been made before, at altitude, where the margin for error was smaller. Administrative officers stationed at the warehouses kept inventory on quipus, hung at the doorways. The colored cords updated each morning with new information about stock levels, intake, and distribution. European clerks observed this system for weeks before attempting to learn it. When they began, they made mistakes that were corrected without comment. When they began to demonstrate accuracy, the Inca administrators acknowledged this with small nods and gradually began to include them in the morning counting. Within a year, several European clerks could read a warehouse quipu with sufficient speed and accuracy to work the morning rounds without oversight. They taught others. The knowledge spread the way practical knowledge always spreads, from hand to hand. The public bathhouses appeared in the neighborhoods closest to the water, fed by stone channels connected to hot spring sources outside the city walls. Sunken stone pools, carefully leveled, held water at a temperature maintained by the flow rate through the channel system. The pools were accessible without cost during certain hours. People arrived in the mornings before work and in the evenings after. The bathhouses became, over time, the places where the daily commerce of city life was conducted in a relaxed and unhurried atmosphere, where problems were discussed and decisions were made and information was exchanged, all in the warm water, with the particular ease of people who are physically comfortable and therefore mentally open. The markets expanded to accommodate the new crops. Dried potato in its various forms appeared in stalls alongside bread and salted fish. Quinoa was sold in clay jars sealed with wax. Freeze-dried corn could be reconstituted in cold water and was sold alongside instructions, communicated by gesture to customers who had never encountered it, for how to do so. Inca food preparation specialists set up small cooking stations at the edge of the market and demonstrated dishes to crowds that grew larger each day. The smell of unfamiliar spices mixed with the smell of European baking, and the result was, by all available accounts, excellent. What was being built in Madrid and Paris during these years was not Inca architecture. It was not European architecture. It was something that had not existed before and therefore did not have a name. The people building it did not feel the need to name it. They were too busy building it. A trapezoidal doorway and a pointed Gothic arch occupied the same street. A granite terrace and a medieval tower shared the same skyline. An aqueduct fed water through carved stone channels into public fountains of both traditions. The city was not a museum of the encounter. It was the encounter continuing in stone and water, and the daily movement of people through streets that carried both histories without requiring either to be primary. A mason set a final stone in a wall late one afternoon, when the light was low and golden and the street was quiet. He ran his hand along the join between two blocks and felt the surfaces meet cleanly, with no gap and no excess. He stood back and looked at the wall from a short distance. He looked at it for a long time without speaking. Then he picked up his tools and walked home through streets where the smoke from both kinds of cooking fires rose and mixed in the cooling air above the rooftops and became, at a sufficient height, indistinguishable from each other. Gold, in the Inca world, was a material with specific properties. It did not corrode. It conducted heat with unusual efficiency. It reflected light at angles that could be calculated and used. It could be worked into any shape a craftsman required and would hold that shape indefinitely. It was therefore used for construction, for lining water channels, for facing walls in positions where its reflective properties would direct winter light into spaces that would otherwise remain cold and dim. It was a functional material. Its beauty was inseparable from its function. There was no other category available for it. The European merchants who first observed gold being used to line drainage channels in Madrid required some time to adjust their understanding. Gold in the European economy was stored value. It was currency and reserve, and the material foundation of power as they understood it. The idea that it might be used to waterproof a stone gutter, that its reflective surface was the point rather than incidental, required a conceptual adjustment that did not happen in a single conversation. It happened over months, through observation, through the evidence of what the gold actually did in practice. Through the slowly accumulating experience of walking down a street on a cold morning and finding it warmer than the streets without gold-lined channels, and gradually understanding why. The metalworking workshops ran day and night in both cities. Inca craftsmen worked at benches set up along the interior walls of large stone buildings, each bench equipped with specific tools for specific stages of the process. Sheet gold was worked to consistent thickness using stone formers of increasing precision. The sheets were then cut to dimensions specified by the architectural plans and fitted into place on prepared stone surfaces. The fitting was exact. The joins were tight. A sheet of beaten gold, pressed flat against a stone wall, reflected light with a clarity that seemed to belong to the gold rather than the wall behind it, as if the light were being generated rather than redirected. European apprentices were welcomed into the workshops from the beginning. They stood at adjacent benches and watched before they touched anything. When they were ready to begin, they were given simple forming tasks and shown the correct motion once. The Inca craftsmen did not hover or repeat instructions that had already been understood. They allowed the apprentices to work at their own pace, checking the results at intervals and correcting what needed correction without commentary on what had gone well. The apprentices developed skill at different rates. All of them, given sufficient time, developed skill. The public buildings of Madrid received their gold cladding in sections, working from the top down. Workers on timber scaffolding fixed sheets to prepared stone surfaces using a technique that distributed the attachment points evenly across the back of the sheet, allowing for the slight thermal expansion that occurred on warm days without producing buckle or gap. The sheets were positioned to direct morning sunlight into the public squares below at angles calculated to warm the stone paving and the people who walked across it. The calculation was not approximate. It was geometry applied to daily life, the way all good infrastructure is. A watchtower at the northern edge of Paris received a ring of gold plates at its upper exterior, positioned to catch and amplify the fires lit there as warning signals on nights of low visibility. The first night, the signal fires were tested with the new cladding in place. The amplified light was visible from a distance 3 times greater than before. The guards who operated the tower stood and watched the light move across the fog with an expression that was purely practical. A problem that had existed for generations had been solved by someone who had thought about it more carefully. The expression was satisfaction. In a palace garden in Madrid, a courtyard held a small grove of life-sized corn stalks made of beaten gold. Each stalk was rooted in dark soil. The leaves were shaped and veined with precision. The ears were detailed to the individual kernel. A European noble who was shown this garden on a winter afternoon walked among the stalks slowly, touching nothing, looking at everything. He did not speak for several minutes. He was experiencing something for which his vocabulary did not yet have an adequate word. The recognition that beauty and function had been understood in this tradition as aspects of the same thing, and that separating them had not been considered necessary or even possible. The gold-clad rooftops of Paris changed the experience of the city at night. On evenings when the moon was up and the sky was clear, the light that fell on the gold surfaces was gathered and redirected into the streets below, at angles that made the city luminous in a way that torchlight alone had never achieved. People walking home late looked up at the rooftops and then at the pale light on the cobblestones, and understood, without needing to analyze it, that they were seeing something that had been designed, that the beauty was not accidental but intentional, which made it somehow more beautiful. The children who grew up in Madrid and Paris during these years played in courtyards where gold-clad slides warmed in the afternoon sun and were still warm to the touch when the light had shifted. They did not think of this as remarkable. The warm slides, the aqueduct water, the rope bridges, the fields of potato plants in the market gardens outside the walls, these were simply the features of the world as they had found it. They had no memory of a version of the city without these things. They would grow up and build more things, combining what they had inherited from both traditions without experiencing the two as separate, because for them they had never been. The craftsmen who worked the gold developed a relationship with the material that was, by all accounts, one of unusual patience. Gold responds slowly to the former. It requires repetition, hundreds of small strokes to move the surface by a degree that would be invisible to anyone not looking closely. The craftsmen who worked it for years developed a quality of attention that was transferable to other materials, other problems, other scales of work. They brought this quality of attention to everything they made. The things they made lasted. The deepest transfer of the entire encounter may not have been the potato, which fed generations. It may not have been the aqueduct, which changed the experience of daily life in two major cities. It may not have been the surgical technique, or the bridge, or the grain storage system, each of which solved a problem that had existed for a long time. It may have been this, the idea that the useful could be beautiful, that beauty was not an addition to function, but a dimension of it, that a city was not merely a system for keeping people alive, but an argument made in stone and water and light about what it meant to be alive in the first place. A craftsman finished the last sheet in a long run of gold cladding on a water channel in central Paris and sat back on his heels and watched the water move through it. The gold gathered the low afternoon light and scattered it across the surface of the water, and the light moved with the water, and the effect was that the channel itself seemed to be generating light from somewhere within its depth. Passers-by stopped and looked. A child pressed close to the edge and stared down into the moving light for a long time. The craftsman packed his tools and did not watch them watching it. He had seen it many times. He still considered it worth seeing. What happens after two civilizations have spent several generations in genuine contact with each other is not a merger and not a compromise. It is the appearance of something that could not have been predicted from either side, something that has no predecessor and therefore no name, something that is built from both traditions but identical to neither. This is what happened in Madrid and Paris across the slow years of the encounter. Not a blending, exactly, a becoming. The way a river that joins another river does not blend into it so much as become part of a larger river that is different from both. The markets of both cities, by the third generation after the fleet's arrival, were not Inca markets or European markets. They were simply markets, in the way that a city becomes simply a city after enough time has passed. Dried potatoes sat beside bread loaves in stalls tended by vendors who spoke a working mixture of two languages and managed perfectly well. The smell of chicha mixed with the smell of wood smoke and wool. Llama caravans moved through the cobblestone streets of Madrid with the ordinary purpose of animals engaged in ordinary work, and the children who ran alongside them did so from the same uncomplicated enthusiasm with which children run alongside any interesting animal. The schools taught both counting systems to children who found no particular difficulty in moving between them, the way people raised in two languages find it natural to switch between them as the situation requires. The quipu and the ledger book sat side by side on the same shelf and were consulted for the same kinds of information. Neither had replaced the other. Neither had been designated superior. They had become, instead, tools for different aspects of the same problem, and the people who used them understood which to reach for depending on what they needed to know. The textile cooperative in Paris occupied a large stone building near the river and employed weavers from both traditions who worked on looms set up in long parallel rows under high windows. The cloth they produced carried Andean geometric patterns in European wool using dyes from both continents. Customers came from distant cities to purchase it, not because it was exotic, though it was, but because it was beautiful in a way that neither tradition alone had produced before. The cooperative kept detailed records of every pattern, both in quipu and in ink, so that no variation was lost, and each could be reproduced or developed further by whoever came next. The judicial courts of both cities held representatives of both traditions, applying principles from each in cases that were understood to draw on a shared body of knowledge about how people ought to treat each other. The proceedings were conducted in both languages, with intermediaries present to ensure that nothing important was lost in the movement between them. The court records were kept in both systems. The decisions that were reached drew on precedents from both traditions, and the reasoning that connected them was, over time, something that belonged to neither tradition exclusively, and both traditions in part. The public clinics combined altitude plant medicine with the anatomical knowledge that European physicians had accumulated across centuries of scholarship. Neither system was diminished by the combination. Each was made more complete by contact with what the other had developed in its absence. Inca healers learned to use European diagnostic categories. European physicians learned to use Inca plant preparations. The patients who came to these clinics arrived in pain and left, when they left, better. Which was the point, which had always been the point. The agricultural land surrounding both cities had been transformed over the generations by the introduction of new crops and new cultivation techniques. Fields of potato and quinoa grew alongside rye and wheat in a rotation system that had been developed through the practical collaboration of farmers who had spoken different languages when they first stood together in a muddy field and found that they understood each other well enough through gesture and observation to work the ground together. The land fed more people than it had before. The people it fed did not, for the most part, think about why. They were simply full, which was the best possible outcome. On a mountainside above Madrid, a stepped sanctuary had been built on high ground in the decades following the fleet's arrival. It was built from granite, with wide flat terraces that looked out over the valley and the city below. At the winter solstice, families gathered there before dawn and stood in the cold air, looking east, watching the light come up over the far hills. It was not a ceremony that belonged to one tradition. It was not described or organized as a ceremony at all. People simply came, year after year, because the view from the terraces at the moment when the sun first cleared the hill was one of the best things that the city offered, and had been since anyone could remember. The llama caravans moved through Madrid streets in the early mornings, when the city was quiet, laden with goods for the market from the agricultural districts outside the walls. The caravan drivers called to each other in a mix of languages that anyone under the age of 30 understood without effort. The llamas were indifferent to the cobblestones, as they had been indifferent to mountain paths, stepping carefully and maintaining their own opinions about the pace. Children who were up early watched them from windows and doorways with the sleepy appreciation of people watching something familiar that is still pleasant to see. The rope bridges over European rivers had long since stopped being remarkable. They carried ordinary traffic, merchants with loaded carts, farmers with animals, travelers with bundles on their backs. The bridges were maintained on a regular schedule by workers who had learned the technique from Inca engineers and had in turn taught it to others, who had in turn taught it to others again. The knowledge had passed through enough hands that it no longer had a clear point of origin, the way most important knowledge eventually loses its origin story and becomes simply what people know. A scholar in a public square in Paris used a painted canvas scroll to teach a group of children who sat in a loose circle on the paving stones around her. The children were of different ages and different origins, and did not appear to experience these as significant differences. They were paying attention to the scroll. The scroll carried diagrams of the night sky with annotations in both traditions side by side, each illuminating what the other had approached from a different direction. And the children asked questions about what they could not understand, and the scholar answered each question and moved on, and the afternoon light moved across the square with its usual patience. A figure stood on a stone terrace above Paris late on a winter afternoon. The city below him carried two histories in its skyline: Gothic spires and granite terraces, pointed arches and trapezoidal gates, gold-plated rooftops catching the last horizontal light, rope bridges over the dark river. He had been born in this city and had known no other. He understood both of the histories visible in the skyline, the way a person raised in two languages understands both, not as separate systems to be switched between, but as aspects of a single way of being that he could not imagine being divided. He stood on the terrace for a long time, looking at the city without deciding anything about it, and then the cold came, and he went inside. History, in the version most people know, moved across the Atlantic in one direction, and what arrived on far shores was not exchange. In this version, it moved in both directions, across an ocean that both sides had learned to read, and what arrived on the European shore was not power or conquest or the imposition of one world on another. It was something older and quieter and more difficult to name. Two civilizations looked at each other across 30 meters of cold Atlantic water on a gray morning, with fishing nets held loosely and reed boats rocking in the shallow surf, and found that the world was larger than either had imagined, and that the size of it was, upon reflection, a very good thing. They had not known this was possible, neither had the other, and in the long years that followed, in the markets and the workshops and the schools and the terraces and the ordinary mornings, they built, without a blueprint, something that demonstrated it.